A new bar opened up near my neighborhood, hosting a promotional event. Sally, the alluring bar owner, announced that anyone who managed to drink 10 cocktails could take home anything from the bar. Following the principle of never pass up a good deal, I downed 10 drinks without batting an eye. However, just as everyone thought I'd grabbed the most expensive bottle of liquor, I hoisted the gorgeous bartender, Vicky, over my shoulder and bolted for the door. The usually composed and elegant Sally finally lost her cool. She yelled, "Stop right there, young man, put my daughter down." The bar across the street had been under renovation for ages, and it had finally opened. My buddy Charles dragged me over, eager to check it out. "Let me tell you," he said, "the bar owner is a stunningly beautiful woman, absolutely captivating." I gave him a warning look. "Careful, man. You've got a thing for older women, and you know it never ends well. Remember your last relationship? You were practically drained dry." Charles waved me off, dismissing my concerns. "Relax, I've got this. Besides, today's their grand opening. I heard there's a promotion, drink 10 cocktails without passing out, and you can take anything you want from the bar." We exchanged a glance, already understanding each other. I had inherited my dad's legendary drinking skills, which meant I could handle more than the average person. This was an opportunity I couldn't pass up. When we arrived, the place was packed, the atmosphere buzzing with excitement. Charles pulled me to the front where a tall, skinny man was gulping down a drink. In front of him were 5 or 6 empty glasses. Halfway through his latest drink, the guy suddenly swayed and stumbled off toward the restroom, breaking through the crowd. A collective groan of disappointment swept through the room. Then, a woman's voice rang out. "Not bad, young man. Anyone else want to give it a shot?" I craned my neck to see who was speaking. The woman was mature yet incredibly alluring, dressed in a burgundy off-shoulder dress that hugged her figure perfectly. Her wavy hair cascaded over her pale shoulders in an effortlessly glamorous way. Next to me, Charles was practically drooling. "Wow, she's amazing," he muttered under his breath. Before I could react, Charles grabbed my hand and thrust it into the air, shouting, "We've got a challenger!" All eyes turned to me. I blinked, then smirked. "Fine, I'll give it a try." Sally glanced over, her lips curling into a smile. "Young man, these drinks are pretty strong." I stepped up to the bar, where a fresh row of glasses awaited me. "Let's find out," I said. 1 drink, 2 drinks, 3 drinks. The more casual my demeanor, the more shocked the crowd grew. By the 5th glass, Sally raised a hand to stop me. Tossing her hair over her shoulder, she said, "Take it easy, kid. These are cocktails, not water." I waved her off and grabbed another glass, downing it in one go. Seeing my determination, she didn't press further. The chatter around me gradually died down as the spectators focused on my drinking spree. Soon enough, 9 empty glasses lined the bar. I finished the 10th drink with a flourish, slamming the glass down on the counter. The crowd erupted in cheers. "Amazing, this guy's a legend," someone shouted. Amid the applause and laughter, I started scanning the bar for what I wanted to take home. My eyes landed on a corner of the bar where a girl in a white blouse stood quietly polishing glasses. Under the flickering lights, her long lashes cast delicate shadows on her cheeks. Her slender fingers moved gracefully over the glass surface. For a moment I was transfixed. Sally's voice snapped me out of my daze. "Well, young man, have you decided what you want?" I hiccuped and asked. "Anything in the bar, right?" Sally smiled warmly. "Of course. As long as it's in my bar, it's yours." I nodded, pausing to think. Charles leaned in and whispered, "Go for that blue bottle on the right, it's expensive." I glanced in the direction he indicated, then turned and strode towards the bar corner instead. Charles grinned. "Yep, good choice. Wait, what are you?" His words trailed off, and the entire bar fell silent as I grabbed Vicky, the bartender, and threw her over my shoulder. Without hesitation, I made my way toward the door. The ever-graceful Sally's face twisted in shock. "Stop, young man, put my daughter down." I turned to her, puzzled. "Didn't you say I could take anything in the bar?" Her lips trembled as she stammered, "She's not a thing." I glanced at Vicky, then back at Sally. "She says you're not a thing," I said seriously. Vicky, who had been too stunned to react, finally let out a soft laugh. "You're something else," she said, her voice tinged with amusement. Before she could say more, I adjusted my hold on her and walked out of the bar. Behind me, I heard Charles shrieking, "What the hell? This actually works? I swear I wasn't drunk." The real reason I acted so impulsively was because I recognized Vicky. Back in high school, she was Victoria, the school's most famous beauty, and my secret crush for nearly 3 years. The cool night air hit my face, instantly sobering me up. The warmth radiating from her body suddenly felt a bit too intense. I quickly set her down. "Sorry," I said. Victoria tilted her head. "Sorry for what, the hug?" "No," I said, "for carrying you out like that." We locked eyes for a moment before I awkwardly looked away. I'd just downed 10 cocktails without flinching, yet now I felt like a blushing fool. She probably thought I was some drunken lunatic. What a mess. I'd heard back in high school that her parents were divorced and her family situation was complicated. By now, she should have just graduated college. So why was she working in a bar, calling that woman Mom? Could it be a stepmother situation? I didn't want to overthink it. I just wanted to get her out of there. The bar was full of all sorts of shady characters, and I instinctively felt that someone like her didn't belong in such a place. At the moment, Victoria and I were standing face to face, the air between us awkwardly tense. Just as I was about to speak, someone suddenly came running out of the bar. His eyes lit up when he saw us. "Sir," he called out as he hurried over. "The gentleman inside, Mr. Charles, is your friend, right?" I nodded. "Yes," he continued. "He just downed 10 cocktails in a row and insisted on dragging our boss, Sally, out of the bar with him." I was speechless. Victoria turned to me and asked, "Sincere, is your friend trying to make Sally his sugar mommy?" I didn't respond. Instead, I sprinted into the bar. I knew Charles's drinking limits all too well, 3 drinks max. And sure enough, when I rushed in, Charles was clinging tightly to Sally, refusing to let go. Victoria walked up beside me, glanced at Sally, and raised an eyebrow. "That's my godmother, Sarah," she said. I nodded. "Got it now." While we were standing there, a scene was unfolding. On our side, everything was relatively calm, but over there, it was complete chaos. "Young man, can you let go already?" Sally said, her graceful demeanor barely holding up as she looked utterly exasperated. Charles's face was flushed, clearly drunk. He shook his head while holding on to Sally even tighter. "No way," he slurred. "You said whatever's in the bar is fair game." As soon as he said that, every person watching the commotion turned their gaze to me. After all, I had just dragged a bartender, Vicky, out of the bar moments earlier. Sally noticed me too. She frowned and said, "Hey you, get him out of here now." I felt a chill run down my spine. Without hesitation, I rushed forward, yanked Charles off Sally while he wasn't paying attention, and hauled him out on my shoulder without looking back. It was humiliating. Today the two of us had made a spectacle of ourselves, as if we had just relieved ourselves in public. Dragging a thoroughly inebriated Charles, I fled the scene. Just before exiting, I glanced back at the bar's neon sign. Elysium. How fitting, I thought. Well, I'm never coming back to this soul-crushing place. Once outside, I had a nagging feeling that someone was chasing us, but I was too out of breath to care. My face was flushed, my teeth clenched, and I was on the verge of collapse. Mustering what little energy I had left, I carried Charles as far away as I could. When I finally got him home, I collapsed onto the floor, completely drained. Charles passed out cold, and the apartment gradually fell silent. Only then did I have a moment to replay the night's events in my head. I never imagined I'd run into Victoria again under such circumstances. It brought back memories of the first time I met her. It was our first year of high school. "Sincere, come up and solve this problem," the teacher called out, catching me off guard while I was daydreaming. I froze. I was a mediocre student at best, and getting into this school had been a fluke. The teachers taught at breakneck speed, and I was already struggling to keep up. Being called to the board to solve a problem was my worst nightmare. The classroom fell silent. Everyone's eyes were on me. I was sweating bullets, staring at the problem on the board, reading it over and over without comprehending a single word. Sincere, start writing. It's not that hard, the teacher urged impatiently. I frowned, my mind blank. Then a clear and light voice came from the doorway. Teacher. Instinctively I turned to look. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the light, was a slender girl whose features were hard to make out. Miss Smith, she said, addressing the teacher, I just came to grab the exams for our class. The frosty expression on our math teacher's face melted instantly. Oh, Victoria. One moment, I left them in the office, she said with a smile. So, this was Victoria, the top student who had aced the entrance exams and the school's brightest star. After the teacher left in a rush, I remained at the board, unable to take my eyes off Victoria. The classroom buzzed with hushed chatter, and no one else seemed to notice us. Victoria walked a few steps closer, glanced at the board, then at me. Tilting her head slightly, she asked, You don't know how to do it, do you? Scratching my head awkwardly, I admitted no. She pointed to a part of the equation. Try applying the substitution formula here, she suggested, looking at me intently. Flustered, I nodded and turned back to the problem. I started thinking. At that moment, two thoughts dominated my mind. One, she's stunning, and two, what the heck is the substitution formula? Fortunately, I managed to solve the problem in the end. I didn't remember the solution, but I did remember Victoria, and for the next 3 years I couldn't get her out of my mind. Pathetic, right? I never thought Charles would be even more shameless than me. She's absolutely gorgeous, he said. She's my dream woman. I can't just give up. I shook my head. I've embarrassed myself enough. Charles added, I found out Sally's only 35. She's not that much older than me, just 6 years. And she's loaded. 2 gold bars, man. Right now he was like a moth to a flame, knowing full well he'd get burned but diving in anyway. Not me. I value my life. Seeing that I wouldn't budge, Charles went off to the bar on his own. Don't drink, I shouted after him. 10 minutes later, I was pulling on my jacket and heading out the door. I didn't trust his drinking limits for a second. Elysium was still packed when I arrived. I didn't dare go in, so I found a cafe across the street and sat down. If anything happened to Charles, I'd be ready to rush in. A moment later, someone walked up to me and said, Hello, here's your espresso. I glanced at the bar's entrance without turning around and replied, Just put it down. Then I froze. That voice, it was so familiar. I turned around in shock to look at the person. Victoria? What are you doing here? I asked, bewildered. She was wearing a coffee shop uniform and placed the coffee on the table. With a cold snort, she said, Isn't it obvious? I'm working. I pointed toward the bar and asked, Aren't you a bartender over there? Victoria smiled. I work there on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Here on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. I was speechless. She was so hard-working, and I was so unlucky. After finishing her tasks, Victoria brought over a cup of tea and sat down across from me. I was stunned for a moment. She asked, You've been glancing toward the bar. Are you worried about your friend? I replied, He can't handle his alcohol very well. Victoria chuckled softly and said, Don't worry, Sarah will take care of him. She was referring to Sarah, the bar owner. I hesitated, but finally spoke up. I want to apologize for last time. My friend and I caused trouble at your bar and ruined the event. Victoria smiled. It's fine. Thanks to you two, the atmosphere was pretty lively that night. I breathed a sigh of relief and said, That's good to hear, but Victoria continued, I still want to ask you something. What is it? I asked. What were you thinking that night? She said. The coffee I had just taken a sip of nearly sprayed out of my mouth. After a few seconds of silence, I sincerely replied, I thought you were really beautiful and had some inappropriate thoughts, but I've since reflected deeply on my behavior and realized I was wrong. Please forgive me. What could I say? I couldn't possibly tell her I was trying to save a damsel in distress. Victoria gave me a look I couldn't quite read. I didn't dare meet her gaze and instead turned to look out the window. And there he was, Charles, staggering out of the bar. One look and I could tell he had been drinking. Following close behind were two shady guys, clearly arguing with him. It seemed Charles had gotten drunk and had a scuffle with them. I immediately stood up, pushed the door open, and bolted outside. Before I could reach them, Sarah appeared with a few bodyguards. She walked up to Charles, pointed at the two thugs, and said, "Hey, what's this? You dare cause trouble on my turf?" The two men exchanged glances, their bravado fading as they muttered under their breath and walked away. Sarah supported Charles by the arm and said, "You, young man, your alcohol tolerance is terrible." Charles squinted at her, then suddenly leaned in and tapped her nose, laughing. "If I could drink more, you wouldn't have to come out here, would you?" Sarah was speechless. I was speechless. Oh, my eyes. Before Sarah could throw him into the nearest dumpster, I quickly jumped in. "Thank you, Miss Sarah. Goodbye, Miss Sarah." I hoisted Charles up and bolted. Behind me, I could hear Sarah and Victoria talking. "That kid looks familiar," Sarah said. Victoria replied, "He's the one who carried me off last time without a word." Sarah laughed. "I thought so. That boy's got energy to spare." After some stern scolding from me, Charles promised never to drink at the bar again. But his frequent visits to Peach Blossom Bar brought me plenty of juicy tidbits. He once told me, "Sarah and Victoria claim to be godmother and goddaughter, but honestly they're more like friends. Sarah's no ordinary woman. Word has it she was once involved with a crime lord. When Victoria's family got into trouble, it was Sarah who stepped in to protect her. That's how they got close. To shield Victoria from gossip, Sarah started calling her her goddaughter. Hearing this, I recalled something from years ago. It was during my junior year of high school when Victoria suddenly took a month off. I heard from various sources that her family was in trouble. Her father, a gambling addict, had run off after borrowing from loan sharks, leaving Victoria and her grandmother to deal with the mess. The debt collectors came knocking, and her grandmother, under immense stress, suffered a stroke and passed away soon after. At the time, many thought Victoria would drop out of school. After a week of hesitation, I finally decided to help. I took my savings jar and headed to her neighborhood. The alleyways were narrow and confusing, and I quickly got lost. Suddenly, I heard shouting and scuffling from a nearby alley. "You owe us money because of your father. If he's run off, we'll take it out on you. Don't even think of running." A loud slap echoed, followed by laughter. "Heard you're the school beauty, huh? Blame your father for this." My heart sank. Following the voices, I saw Victoria on the ground, trembling. I never imagined someone like her would end up in such a situation. Desperate, I knew I couldn't take on the debt collectors by myself. So I ran a few steps away and shouted at the top of my lungs, "Police! There's a robbery happening here! Follow me!" The men cursed and fled down the alley. A few minutes later, Victoria emerged, still shaking. Charles interrupted my story. "And then what?" I shrugged. "Nothing. She didn't see me and I didn't tell her. I left my savings jar at her doorstep, but it probably wasn't much help." Still, Victoria returned to school after a month. After the holiday, everything went back to normal, and we returned to school. Perhaps it was around that time that she had already met Sarah. Fortunately, Victoria still excelled in academics and remained the school goddess that everyone admired. The next time I visited Peach Blossom Bar was the day before Independence Day. Our company had a gathering and the location just so happened to be there. What a coincidence. After just a few drinks, my coworkers began whispering among themselves, occasionally glancing over at the bar. "Sincere, look." One of my coworkers patted me on the shoulder, signaling me to look in that direction. "That bartender is absolutely stunning," he said. I turned to look, and at that moment Victoria happened to lift her head. Our eyes met briefly and she smiled at me. "Holy crap," my coworker exclaimed. "I finally understand why this bar does so well. They've got a walking advertisement over there." Another coworker chimed in. "Just drinking is so boring. Come on, let's play a game." The game was called Skip 7, a numbers-based game. Being the slowest in math, I barely made it through 3 rounds, but in the 4th, I messed up. Come on, sincere, truth or dare, my coworker asked. Startled, I replied, truth. A chorus of boos erupted. Truth every time? That's so boring. Go for dare. I was speechless, but gave in with a resigned silence. My coworker reassured me. Don't worry, it won't be too bad. He scanned the room, and his eyes lit up as they landed on the bar. All right, here's the dare. Go ask that beautiful bartender for her number. How about it? Not too hard, right? Without hesitation, I stood up. My coworkers were stunned as I walked towards the bar with an air of righteous determination. Victoria's number? What a joke. I had added her on social media the year we graduated high school, though we'd never spoken since. Still, I had to put on a convincing act. When I approached, why is it both bitter and sweet? I asked, puzzled. Victoria smiled. That's why I call it 18. I froze, realizing the significance. This drink was her 18. Your coworkers are watching you, Victoria reminded me, snapping me out of my thoughts. I quickly composed myself. It's fine. I won't bother you anymore. I'll head back now. Grabbing my phone, I returned to my table. So, did you get it? My coworkers asked eagerly, their faces filled with curiosity. Just as I was about to respond, they all pulled out their phones. Push her contact to us, would you? I paused, then stuffed my phone back into my pocket. Sorry, no luck. As punishment for failing the dare, I downed 3 shots in a row and then slumped over the table, pretending to be out cold. If there was ever a time to fake being drunk, this was it. Is Sincere really drunk? Someone asked. Looks like it. He's always the first to go down at our gatherings, another replied. Forget him. Let's keep drinking. Perfect. My acting had improved. As the night wound down, I woke up just in time. You guys go ahead. My friend's coming to pick me up, I said. After my coworkers left, I laid my head back on the table trying to rest. The noise had given me a headache. Now that the bar was quieter, I could even hear the conversation at the bar. Victoria, have you found a place yet? Sarah asked. Not yet, Victoria replied. Why don't you just stay at my place? Sarah suggested. No, I don't want to trouble you, Victoria said. I perked up, trying to catch more, but the conversation abruptly stopped. 3 seconds later, someone helped me to my feet. Confused, I realized it was Victoria, guiding me out of the bar. Her warmth and the faint scent of her perfume made my heart race. Really drunk, huh? She asked softly. With my eyes closed, I replied, drunk. Victoria didn't call me out on my lie. Instead, she let me lean on her shoulder and helped me walk quite a distance. Eventually, guilt got the better of me, and I started walking on my own. Still, tonight was worth it. The cold air sobered me up, I said, feigning recovery. Victoria smiled knowingly. You were never drunk to begin with. I was speechless. This wasn't how I envisioned it. Why wasn't she playing along? Instinctively, I retorted, Then why did you help me out? Victoria was silent for a few seconds before replying. Maybe I thought you were pretty handsome and got some bad ideas. I was at a loss for words. She had turned my own old excuse back on me. Seeing my silence, she didn't press further. All the way home, I kept thinking about her housing situation. It was obvious from her working 2 jobs that her life wasn't easy. Now, on top of everything, she had to find a new place to live. How exhausting her life must be. The dim glow of the streetlights bathed her in a soft light, making her entire figure seem to radiate. I couldn't help but glance at her once, then again, and by the 3rd time she caught me looking. She turned to me and asked, Do I look good? I met her gaze directly and replied without hesitation, Yes, you do. Victoria paused for a moment, clearly startled, and then broke into a sudden smile. You haven't changed a bit, she said. I frowned, confused. What do you mean? She laughed. The first time we met, you looked me straight in the eyes and told me I don't know how, so straightforward. I went home with my mind buzzing. It never occurred to me that Victoria still remembered me after all these years. Lying on my bed, I stared at the ceiling, then reached for my phone and called my mom. Hey, Mom, have we rented out the place on Westfield Street yet?
No, not yet, she replied.
Good. Don't rent it out just yet, I might need it for something. After hanging up, I opened my messaging app and scrolled to Victoria's contact. Back in high school, I had worked up the courage to ask for her number after graduation. She was swarmed by people at the time, so I hurriedly scanned her QR code and ran off. Thinking back, I realized she might not even remember who I was, or worse, she might have deleted me altogether. I hesitated for a few minutes, then mustered up the courage to send a message. Come to Easy Stay Realty for all your buying, selling, and renting needs. Save time, money, and effort with us. Hi there, looking for a place to rent? To my relief, the message sent successfully. She hadn't deleted me. Moments later, she replied with a single question mark. I quickly typed another message. Hello, are you currently in need of a place to rent or buy? I have a great property available, perfect location, and very reasonably priced. Interested? After a brief pause, she replied, How reasonably priced? I guessed Victoria might be short on cash, so I immediately slashed the usual rental price in half. The place is on Westfield Street. Monthly rent is just $2,000. There was no response. Growing anxious, I typed again. We can discuss the price further if you'd like. Still no reply. I quickly typed another message. How about $1,000? This time my phone rang. It was a voice call from Victoria. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. Nervously, I answered, pinching my nose to disguise my voice. Hello? Looking to rent, ma'am? Victoria's voice came through, light with amusement. Sincere, what are you doing? I froze. Then, without thinking, I hung up as fast as I could. My hands had never moved so quickly. Before I could gather my thoughts, a new message popped up, a screenshot of our chat. At the very top, clear as day, was her contact name for me, Sincere. Beneath it, the conversation mocked me, complete with her labeling me as a complete fool. Ah, let the world end already. Any shred of dignity I had just grown was once again obliterated in front of Victoria. I stayed home, wallowing in existential despair. Strangely enough, Charles seemed to have had an epiphany of his own. He stopped frequenting the Peach Blossom, a bar he often visited. What's up? I asked him. Not into older women anymore? Charles shook his head. I'm tired. That lady's a tough nut to crack. I nodded in agreement. Yeah, Sarah does seem like the type who's been through a lot. She's probably seen it all. Better take your time with that one. We exchanged a glance and sighed in unison, true comrades in misery. Charles turned to me and asked, By the way, why are you so into Victoria? Just because she helped you with a math problem once? I thought about it for a moment and replied, yes and no. To be honest, without her, I wouldn't have gotten into college. Victoria, to me, is like a little son. Back when she hit rock bottom, I was also drowning in self-doubt. I couldn't keep up with the teachers, and my grades plummeted along with my mood. I was even ready to give up on college altogether. But when Victoria came back to school, she was still that unreachable star, still excelling in everything, as if nothing had happened. Her resilience made me feel ashamed of myself. Just by standing there, she seemed to shine. So, falling for her, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. I didn't have long to wallow before my mom called. Her booming voice snapped me out of my daze. Where did you leave the keys to the Westfield Street property? Why? I asked, sitting up straight. Someone rented it. I need to give them the keys. What? I told you not to rent it out yet. I might have a friend who wants it. My mom paused. Well, it's too late now. A young lady already took it, and I agreed. Groaning, I leapt off the bed, grabbed the keys, and rushed to Westfield Street. And there, standing in front of the property, was Victoria. We stared at each other, dumbfounded. I've already seen the place, she said. It's nice. She extended her hand toward me. So the keys? Awkwardly, I handed her the keys, then pulled my mom aside. Mom, how much did you charge her? She held up 4 fingers proudly. 400. I stared at her, speechless. Guilt washed over me as I realized we were practically robbing an innocent girl. After my mom left, I shuffled into the property to find Victoria inspecting the place. "If the rent feels a bit steep, we can renegotiate," I offered hesitantly. Victoria smiled. "Not at all. It's quite reasonable." I fell silent for a few seconds. Victoria turned to look at me and asked, "Do you think I'm poor?" I replied, "Aren't you?" Victoria chuckled. "The Blossom Bar is co-owned by me and my godmother. And the cafe across the street? That's mine too. So yes, I can afford my rent. I wouldn't take advantage of you." "Well, the joke's on me." I smiled and said, "All right, Miss Victoria, take your time. I'll be on my way now." With that, I turned and left, thoroughly embarrassed. But this time my escape wasn't so smooth. I had barely walked a block when I received a photo from Victoria. The picture showed a slightly worn cardboard box. She texted, "I just noticed some old stuff in the corner of the room. Do you still want it?" I glanced at the photo casually and froze. The box contained a mess of books, but peeking out from the bottom was the edge of an envelope. I recognized it immediately. It was the draft of a love letter I had written for her years ago but never delivered. I hastily replied, "Yes, I want it. Wait for me. I'll be there right away." I followed up with a voice message and started running. All I could do now was pray that Victoria wouldn't get too curious. 5 minutes later, I was back on Westfield Street. Victoria was waiting at the door, holding the box, her expression calm as usual. I let out a small sigh of relief and took the box from her without betraying my nerves. "Thanks for this," I said. As I was about to leave, Victoria called out, "Hey, Sincere, are you free tomorrow night?" I was taken aback. "Why?" I asked. She looked at me and said, "To thank you for finding me such a great apartment, I'd like to buy you a drink. How about it?" I was speechless. "Sure, thanks," I mumbled, remembering all the foolish things I had done recently. The next evening, I still showed up at Blossom Bar. The place was packed, and Victoria was busy behind the counter. I sat in a corner, waiting for her. I had to admit, watching her mix drinks was mesmerizing. Clearly, I wasn't the only one who thought so. I had barely zoned out for a moment when a sharply dressed man appeared at the bar. His confident demeanor instantly drew whispers from the crowd. "See that guy over there?" someone murmured nearby. "Yeah, what about him?" "He's a very important person here. His name's Ethan. Comes from a wealthy, powerful family. Looks like he's interested in the bartender." My chest tightened as I instinctively moved closer to the bar. Ethan leaned casually against the counter, looking at Victoria. "Victoria," he said smoothly, "I come here every day just to see you. Can't you have just one drink with me?" Without waiting for a response, he slid a glass of liquor toward her. Victoria glanced at it but didn't move. Ethan poured another drink and added, "If you keep ignoring me, one drink won't be enough to settle this." The atmosphere between them grew tense. My mind blanked, and before I knew it, I walked up to the bar. I picked up the glass in front of Victoria and said, "Sorry, I'm a bit thirsty, borrowing this." Don't ask me where I got such a ridiculous excuse. It was the best I could come up with. I downed the drink in one gulp and reached for the second glass, but Victoria grabbed it before I could. Without a word, she drank it herself. Ethan stared at us, his surprise quickly turning to irritation. "You should have told me you had a boyfriend," he snapped. "Wasted my time." With that, he stormed off, clearly annoyed. I waited a moment, then turned to speak to Victoria, but before I could, she suddenly let go of the glass and collapsed onto a stool. Alarmed, I thought, could she be drunk? That can't be. Her tolerance is worse than Charles's. Panicking, I helped her sit up just as Sarah walked in from outside. Sarah glanced at Victoria and asked, "What happened to her?" Awkwardly, I replied, "She seems drunk." "Drunk?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "How much did she drink?" "One glass," I admitted. Sarah sighed. "Victoria's always been a lightweight. She's probably out for the count." "Can I ask you for a favor, Mr. Sincere?" "What is it?" I asked. "Could you look after her for a bit? The bar's too busy, and I need to tend to the other customers." I glanced at Victoria, who was slumped over the table. After 3 seconds, I nodded firmly. "Don't worry, leave her to me." Sarah left, and I sat down across from Victoria. The bar was noisy, and no one seemed to be paying us any attention. I hesitated, then reached out to touch her hair. 3 seconds later, I held her hand. It felt a bit creepy, but there was something oddly thrilling about it. Who could understand? A little while later, I couldn't resist raising my hand, planning to poke her soft, rosy cheek. But before I could touch her, her hand shot out and grabbed my fingers. I froze. Victoria looked up at me, her gaze sharp and steady, with no trace of drunkenness. She let out a cold snort and said, "What are you sneaking around for?" Caught red-handed, I stammered, I couldn't help it. "You're just so beautiful, I had a moment of weakness." Victoria rolled her eyes. "That's your excuse?" I stared at her, took a deep breath and said seriously, "I have another one." She tilted her head, curious. I met her gaze and said slowly and clearly, "Because I like you." Victoria looked at me and let out a soft laugh. I could tell she was genuinely happy. Just as I was about to come up with an excuse to slip away, she grabbed my arm, refusing to let go. After laughing for a while, she looked up at me and slowly said, "Well, congratulations then, because I like you too." Her words hit me like a thunderbolt, leaving my mind in a daze. I froze, staring blankly at her. Victoria poked my face gently and said, "Snap out of it." Startled back to reality, I stammered, Really, but no coherent sentence came out. Victoria nodded and said, "Come on, let's find somewhere else to talk." We ended up sitting across from each other in a cozy cafe. The atmosphere was both romantic and slightly awkward. Resting her chin on one hand, Victoria broke the silence. "Let me start," she said, looking up at me. "Sincere, I've liked you for quite a while. I can't remember exactly when it started. Maybe it was back in senior year when you secretly brought me breakfast and lied, saying the bakery was running a buy one get one free deal." She chuckled at her own words before continuing, "Sincere, I'm not stupid." I was speechless. Turns out I was the dumb one. She knew all along about the silly things I did for her. And it wasn't just breakfast, I'd also bought her cakes, desserts, fruits, and little stuffed toys, always using the same excuse: store promotions. I thought I was invisible in her world, but apparently I was running around her world completely exposed. Victoria, unfazed by my embarrassment, kept talking. Or maybe it was junior year in that little alley near 13th Street. She paused, looking up at me. "Sincere, your voice is pretty deep, you know, and that orange piggy bank of yours? Super cute." I couldn't bring myself to break it. I stared at her, baffled. How did she even know about that? She continued, or maybe it was even earlier. After finishing her sentence, Victoria smiled at me and asked, "Do you remember when you turned 18? The drink she made back then." I nodded. How could I forget such a unique cocktail? She said, "That drink was my 18th birthday. It was bitter beyond belief. But luckily, you were my little dash of sweetness." I was at a loss for words, my mind spinning like I was in a daydream. At that moment, I wanted to slap myself, just to confirm I wasn't dreaming. I finally managed to respond, albeit awkwardly. "So, you're done?" Victoria nodded. I cleared my throat. "Well, about me liking you. It was love at first sight." Victoria burst out laughing. I instinctively asked, "What's so funny?" She replied, "I'm just relieved. Relieved that I'm good-looking enough." On the way home, I felt like I was floating. Tonight was surreal. When I opened my apartment door, the smell of alcohol hit me in the face. There was someone lying on the floor. "Charles," I called out, rushing to help him up. I quickly made him a bowl of hangover soup. 2 hours later, he finally started to come around. I asked, "What happened to you?" Charles clicked his tongue and said, "You know what? You were right. Married women are way out of my league." Testing the waters, I asked, "So?" Charles sighed. "I'm done. I'm giving up." I nodded. "Good. Knowing when to cut your losses is smart." Charles turned to me and asked, "What about you? Giving up too?" I replied, "Nope, I succeeded." Charles was silent for a few seconds before kicking me out of his apartment. A week later, I was sitting at Peach Blossom Bar watching Victoria mix drinks. She smiled at me and asked, "What are you staring at?" I answered honestly, my girlfriend. Maybe I was too blunt because Victoria seemed at a loss for words and could only laugh. Bang! A sudden noise startled me. I turned to see Sarah standing there, a shattered glass at her feet. She froze for a moment before bending down to clean up. Other bartenders walked over and asked, "Victoria, is something up with the boss today? She seems really out of it." Victoria glanced over briefly before quickly looking away. With a faint smile, she said, "It's nothing. My godmother's on her second marriage." I spent the whole night watching Sarah, who remained distracted the entire time. I asked Victoria, "What's going on with your godmother?" Victoria didn't answer directly. Instead, she asked, "Your friend hasn't been coming to the bar lately, has he?" I nodded. "Yeah. He said he's tired." Victoria pursed her lips. "My godmother may not be young anymore, but she hasn't had that many relationships, you know." I was shocked, turning to look at Sarah. She exuded charm, the kind of woman you'd expect to have endless romantic adventures, but apparently not. "So, Charles has turned into a love him and leave him kind of guy?" A month later, Victoria became incredibly busy. The reason? Sarah disappeared without a word. Charles called me furious. "I just went on a little trip to California and Sarah tracked me down. Did you give her my address?" Feigning ignorance, I replied, "What are you talking about? I don't understand." Charles gritted his teeth. "Sincere, don't play dumb with me." I said, "What?" "Sorry, bad signal. Can't hear you. Hello? Hello?" Then I hung up. Sighing, I muttered to myself, "Looks like I'll be accused of ditching my bros for a girl again." Victoria pinched my arm and said, "We have to trust my godmother. By the end of the year." I spent New Year's Eve with Victoria. Fireworks painted the night sky above us in a dazzling display. Victoria's eyes sparkled as she watched them, completely mesmerized. Standing behind her, I wrapped my arms around her and exhaled softly near her ear. "What's wrong?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. I hesitated before responding. "Do you think we're moving too fast?" Victoria stayed silent for a moment. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, "I thought we might take things slower, honestly. I was worried you didn't really like me." She paused, then added with a faint smile, "But that day at the house on Westfield Street, I found the love letter you wrote to me, and later, seeing how flustered you were, I realized, maybe we could speed up a little." I froze. My love letter. She had seen it after all. Well, there was no use hiding it now. Smiling bitterly, I pulled her closer. Around us, the crowd burst into cheers. A particularly brilliant firework exploded above us, signaling the arrival of a new year. New beginnings lay ahead. Charles's perspective. When Sarah arrived in Denver, I immediately knew Sincere had betrayed our friendship. I called him straight away, and sure enough, that jerk had done it. Furious, I hung up and walked to the window, pulling the curtains aside. Down below, Sarah was standing there with her suitcase, talking to the bed and breakfast owner. "Excuse me," she asked, "is there a Mr. Charles staying here?" The owner, a kind elderly woman, gave her a polite but firm response. "I'm sorry, we can't disclose guest information." But then, almost unconsciously, her eyes flicked in the direction of my room. Sarah, ever the sharp observer, immediately picked up on our reaction. Turning on her heel, she looked directly at my window. Our eyes locked. Caught off guard, I could only give her an awkward wave and a sheepish grin. "Hi, fancy seeing you here," I managed to say. She narrowed her eyes and replied, "Fancy? Hardly. I came here specifically to find you." I was speechless. 10 minutes later, we were sitting in the courtyard staring at each other. I couldn't help but steal a glance at her. Unlike her usual glamorous look at the bar, she was almost entirely barefaced now. Her natural beauty was striking. Noticing my gaze, she scowled. "What?" she snapped. "Disappointed I'm not wearing makeup?" Not at all, I thought to myself. In fact, I found her unexpectedly pure and lovely. But instead of saying that, I asked, "Why are you here?" She rolled her eyes. "To find you." Then, looking directly at me, she added, "Charles, you can't just flirt with me and then disappear. That's pretty irresponsible, don't you think?" I was stunned. What are you talking about? You're making me sound like some kind of jerk. I quickly defended myself. You can't just throw accusations around like that. She smirked. Oh, really? Then why were you at my bar, Peach Blossom, every single day for 3 months? I opened my mouth to argue, but she interrupted me. And don't forget, 1 month ago, you kissed me while drunk. 3 times you touched me. Now tell me, what do you have to say for yourself? I was speechless. That was an accident. But yes, it did happen. Clearing my throat, I stammered. Well, you know my tolerance for alcohol isn't great. That's not an excuse, she shot back. I've been taken advantage of, so you need to take responsibility. I nearly choked on my tea. Was this even the same woman? She used to act so aloof and untouchable back at the bar, barely even acknowledging me. And now? What on earth had gotten into her? This confrontation ended with my utter defeat. I made some excuse about a stomachache and bolted. To my dismay, Sarah decided to stay at the same bed and breakfast. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. At dawn, as the first light crept over the horizon, I finally got out of bed and took a walk along the nearby riverbank. The breeze off the water was cool, and as I sat on a rock, gazing at the calm surface of the river, my chaotic thoughts finally began to settle. Meeting Sarah at the bar had been a complete coincidence. Back then, Sincere had taken off with Vicky, the bartender, leaving me in an awkward situation. I'd just come out of a disastrous relationship myself. My ex had been an elegant, understanding woman, someone I'd considered my soulmate. But over time, she started criticizing me, saying I wasn't good enough, didn't earn enough, and that I'd never be able to settle down. She even suggested I get a vasectomy if I wanted her to stay with me. Sincere had pointed out that I was being emotionally manipulated, and thanks to his intervention, I finally ended that toxic relationship. When I first saw Sarah, I thought she was just like my ex. Maybe out of spite, I decided to pursue her. In that sense, Sincere wasn't wrong to call me a jerk. But Sarah was different. Despite her sultry appearance, she turned out to be surprisingly innocent. I realized this the moment I kissed her and saw her ears turn red. That discovery left me racked with guilt. I needed time to figure out how I truly felt about her. That's why I came to Denver. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind me. A group of shady-looking men approached. The leader stepped forward and said, "Hey buddy, want to make some quick cash? I've got a business opportunity for you." He clapped a hand on my shoulder. I frowned. Without hesitation, I flipped him over in a judo throw. But before I could catch my breath, more men closed in around me. As they were tugging at me, trying to drag me away, and I started to feel my kidneys might not survive the ordeal, a sharp female voice rang out, "Let go of that boy." I was speechless. Sarah came rushing over with a few patrol officers, but in her haste, she tripped and fell. At the hospital, I looked at Sarah, who was now covered in bruises and injuries from her fall, and found myself at a loss for words. I finally said, "Why would you, with your old bones, run so recklessly?" Sarah immediately turned her head to glare at me, puffing her cheeks indignantly. "Who you calling old?" I shrugged. "Whoever's wearing a cast, that's who." She shot me a withering glare and fell silent. The atmosphere grew increasingly awkward. After a long pause, Sarah finally spoke. "I asked Sincere about you," she said. I froze for a moment, and before I could respond, she continued, her voice tinged with grievance. "Charles, I'm not the kind of person they say I am. I was never someone's girl or anything like that. The reason I didn't reply to your messages wasn't because I was playing games with you. I just needed some time to figure out whether I was ready to start a relationship." She lifted her head to look at me, her expression earnest and sincere. "I'm older than you. If we were together, you'd be the one at a disadvantage. That's why I wanted to give you some time to think it through too," she added, lowering her eyes with a hint of sadness. "But I didn't expect you to just leave," she said softly. I stared at her in a daze. I had no idea about any of this. Thinking back, I'd never actually asked her how she felt. After a long silence, I let out a sigh under her intense gaze. When I helped Sarah out of the hospital, a passing doctor reminded me, Your mom's doing fine. Just make sure she gets plenty of rest for a few days." I was speechless. Before Sarah could start cursing, I quickly whisked her away. I stayed in Denver for a week, and Sarah stayed there as well. When urgent matters at work called me back, I hesitated for a moment before knocking on Sarah's hotel room door. When she opened the door, I caught a faint whiff of perfume. Taking a closer look, I noticed she had done her makeup, styled her hair, and even sprayed on some perfume. She looked much younger. "Starting fresh, huh?" I thought to myself. Feigning nonchalance, Sarah asked, "What is it?" "I'm heading back tomorrow," I said. She froze for a moment, a flicker of disappointment crossing her face. Pressing her lips together, she replied, "Got it, then I." Before she could finish, I interrupted her. "I wanted to ask if you'd like to come with me." She stared at me in stunned silence. I smiled and said, "I've realized that traveling with someone might be more fun than going solo. Sarah, let's go together." Sarah looked at me intently, and then she smiled. "All right," she said. When we were on our way back, it happened to be New Year's Eve. Fireworks burst into bloom in the sky outside the car window. Sitting in the car, our fingers intertwined, I said, "Once we're back, I'll take you to set off some fireworks." She smiled. "Okay." The streets were bustling with crowds. My sharp eyes immediately spotted two familiar figures in the throng. "I see Ethan and Victoria," I said. "Let's go say hi." Sarah glanced in their direction and said, "Let's not disturb their time together. It doesn't feel right." Her words reminded me of something. Technically, Sarah was Victoria's godmother. That made me, by association, sort of a senior figure in Victoria's life. Now Sincere really would have to call me Dad. What a surreal situation. I chuckled and said, "It's amazing how Ethan and Victoria managed to find each other in this vast crowd. It must be fate." Sarah couldn't help but laugh. "Fate? It's more like inevitability." I looked at her, puzzled. She explained, "The Peach Blossom Lounge wasn't originally supposed to open in that neighborhood. My initial choice was a spot in the city center, but Victoria insisted on this location. She said she wanted to try her luck." I was surprised. "Was her luck Ethan?" Sarah nodded. "Looks like her gamble paid off." Then she turned to look at me, a soft smile on her face. "But I'd say I'm pretty lucky too." As she spoke, the clock struck midnight. Cheers of celebration poured into the car through the windows. "Happy New Year. A fresh start for everything," Sarah said, turning to look at me. "Happy New Year, Mr. Charles," she added with a playful smile. "Happy New Year, my Miss Sarah," I replied with a grin.